Sometimes the dead speak louder than the living. I'm Miss Marple. Welcome to my new case.
The morning of the church garden. Tea dawned with that particular clarity that seems to promise nothing more eventful than a mild dispute over the placement of the jam stall. St. Mary Mead lay drowsing in the September sunshine, its cottages and gardens arranged with the comfortable untidiness of a village that had grown rather than been planned. At the vicarage, preparations were already well underway, with Mrs. Griselda Clement orchestrating the transformation of her husband's beloved garden into a suitable venue for the annual fundraising event. Miss Jane Marple sat in her customary wicker chair near the rose border, ostensibly supervising the arrangement of trestle tables while her knitting needles moved with their usual steady rhythm. She had been invited, as she so often was, to lend what Griselda cheerfully called moral support and an extra pair of eyes. In truth, Miss Marple's presence at village events had become something of a tradition, her gentle observations and practical suggestions proving invaluable when tempers ran high over the positioning of the tombola or the pricing of Mrs. Price Ridley's notorious rock cakes. The Reverend Leonard Clement emerged from his study, blinking in the bright morning light like a benevolent owl. He surveyed the bustling scene with the expression of a man who had learned to find pleasure in organized chaos, though Miss Marple noticed the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested he was already anticipating the inevitable complications that accompanied any village gathering. "Tom," Griselda called to the young man, who was wrestling with a particularly stubborn folding table near the garden shed. "Do be careful with that leg. It's been wobbly since the harvest festival 3 years ago." Tom Briggs, whose enthusiasm for manual labor was generally inversely proportional to the complexity of the task at hand, gave the table a vigorous shake that did nothing to inspire confidence in its stability. He was a pleasant enough young man, Miss Marple reflected, though possessed of that modern tendency to approach problems with energy rather than method. She had observed this trait in several of her nephews and had learned to recognize the particular expression that preceded either remarkable success or spectacular failure. "I'll just fetch the spare tablecloth from the shed," Tom announced, abandoning the recalcitrant table with evident relief. "And perhaps those extra candlesticks Mrs. Clement mentioned. The brass ones from the church store?" "Yes, the pair from the vestry," Griselda confirmed, not looking up from her list. "They're on the shelf behind the garden tools. Do mind the door. The latch sticks terribly." Miss Marple's needles paused almost imperceptibly as she watched Tom disappear around the corner toward the old garden shed. There was something about the casual mention of the church candlesticks that stirred a faint unease, though she could not have said precisely why. Perhaps it was simply the knowledge that valuable items had a way of wandering from their proper places during the confusion of village events. Or perhaps it was the memory of a similar occasion years ago, when missing silver had caused considerable embarrassment all around. The crash, when it came, was followed by a silence that seemed to expand like ripples on a pond. It was not the simple clatter of dropped tools or overturned flower pots, but something heavier, more final. Miss Marple set down her knitting and rose with the unhurried grace of someone who had learned that haste often obscured important details. Tom's voice, when it finally came, carried across the garden with a quality that made both the vicar and his wife stop what they were doing and turn toward the shed. "Mrs. Clement, sir, you'd better come quickly." The young man appeared at the corner of the path, his face pale beneath his summer tan, his hands visibly shaking as he gestured toward the shed. "There's something in there, something that shouldn't be. One of those candlesticks, the brass ones from the church, it's—" He swallowed hard, unable to complete the sentence. Griselda dropped her clipboard, the papers scattering in the light breeze. "What do you mean, Tom? What's wrong with the candlestick?" "It's covered in blood," Tom said simply. "Dark, dried blood. And it's been hidden under some sacking, like someone wanted to keep it out of sight." The Reverend Clement's face went very still. Miss Marple, who had moved closer during this exchange, found herself studying not just Tom's frightened features, but the way the morning light fell across the garden shed, the angle of the door, and the small details that others might overlook in their shock. The shed door, she noted, was standing wider than it had been moments before, and there were scuff marks in the earth near the threshold that suggested recent, hurried activity. "Perhaps," she said gently, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet, "we should have a look before we disturb anything further. And then I rather think we shall need to telephone Inspector Slack." The peaceful morning had shifted, almost imperceptibly, into something else entirely. The garden tea would proceed, Miss Marple was quite certain. Village events had a way of continuing regardless of circumstances, but the discovery in the shed had introduced a note of discord that would not easily be resolved. As she followed the vicar toward the weathered wooden structure, she found herself wondering not just about the bloodied candlestick, but about the hands that had placed it there and the reason they had chosen the vicarage garden for concealment. Human nature, she had long observed, was remarkably consistent in its inconsistencies, and someone had made a very significant mistake indeed. The interior of the shed carried that particular mustiness of enclosed spaces where garden tools and forgotten church paraphernalia mingled in comfortable disorder, overlaid now with something metallic that Miss Marple recognized with a small, inward sigh. The faint smell of creosote and damp wood could not quite mask the unmistakable scent of dried blood that seemed to hang in the still air like an unwelcome visitor. The Reverend Clement hesitated on the threshold, his usual gentle demeanor taking on an unexpected firmness. "Perhaps I had better look first, Miss Marple," he said, though his voice carried the uncertainty of a man trying to assert authority over circumstances that had abruptly slipped beyond his pastoral experience. "Of course, Leonard," she replied mildly, positioning herself where she could observe without interfering. "I can see quite well from the doorway." The candlestick lay partially concealed beneath a length of burlap sacking, exactly as Tom had described. It was indeed one of the brass pieces from the church vestry, recognizable by the distinctive pattern of grapevines that wound around its base, a detail that confirmed its theft from sacred ground. The dark staining along the heavy base and up the stem left little doubt about its nature, though Miss Marple noted with interest that the blood appeared to have dried in distinct patterns, suggesting the weapon had been wiped or handled after the initial violence. "When did you last see both candlesticks in their proper place, Vicar?" Miss Marple inquired gently, her pale blue eyes moving methodically around the shed's interior. Leonard Clement's brow furrowed in concentration. "Sunday evening, certainly. I remember noticing them when I locked up after evensong, around 7:30. Mrs. Hartnell had lingered to discuss the flower arrangements, and I recall the candlelight catching on the brass as we spoke." Tom Briggs, who had been hovering near the doorway with the uncertain air of someone who wished to be helpful but feared making matters worse, cleared his throat. "I was here yesterday afternoon, sir, around 4:00. Mrs. Clement asked me to move some items from the church hall. The shed door was standing open when I arrived. I thought Mrs. Clement had left it that way for me." Griselda's voice came sharp with concern from outside. "But I didn't leave it open, Tom. I specifically remember closing it Monday evening after fetching the pruning shears. The latch is troublesome, but I always ensure it catches properly." The implications settled over them like a cold mist. Someone had entered the shed between Monday evening and Tuesday afternoon. Someone who had brought a bloodied candlestick stolen from the locked church vestry. Miss Marple's gaze traced the scuffed earth near the threshold and the faint marks on the wooden floor. Not the heavy impressions of work boots, but the narrower prints of a gentleman's shoe. The screech of brakes in the lane announced Inspector Slack's arrival, and moments later his solid frame appeared, bristling with aggressive competence. "Well, Mr. Clement," he said briskly, removing his hat, "let's see what we have here. And Miss Marple, I might have known you'd be in the middle of it." "Oh, I'm hardly in the middle of anything, Inspector." Miss Marple smiled benignly. "I was merely sitting in the garden when things occurred." Slack's examination was swift and professional. "Good Lord." His voice came from within the shed, sharper than before. "If this candlestick's been used as it appears, then somewhere not far from here there's a body, or there was." Despite the grim discovery, it was decided that the garden tea should proceed. Cancellation would only fuel panic and speculation. By the time the first guests arrived, the news had traveled with a mysterious velocity peculiar to rural communities, mutating from grim fact into a dozen different fantastical narratives. "It's a tramp, mark my words," declared Mrs. Price Ridley, holding court near the tea urn. "I saw a shifty character near the level crossing yesterday. Wild look in his eye, and boots that hadn't seen polish since the war." The identity of the victim had been assumed by the village hive mind. Silas Vane, the churchwarden, had not appeared for his morning duties, and his cottage remained locked tight. He was a man of sharp tongue and rigid principles who made enemies with disturbing ease, yet possessed the keys to the vestry where the candlesticks were kept. "A tramp? Unlikely," sniffed Miss Hartnell conspiratorially. "Silas was too mean to be robbed. This has the hallmark of personal grudge. I heard he had a terrible row with the new organist, young Mr. Finch, just last Tuesday." Miss Marple noted that Mr. Finch was currently standing by the tombola, looking wretchedly pale and dropping tickets with clumsy fingers. He avoided eye contact with everyone, particularly the police constable by the gate. Terror, she reflected, was not proof of guilt, though it was certainly suggestive of a sensitive nature overwhelmed by proximity to violence. Through the swirling theories and gossip, Miss Marple observed not just the speakers, but the listeners, noting how each explanation reflected the teller more than any truth. But one discordant note struck her sharper than the rest. While the village buzzed with speculation about Silas Vane's fate, one person remained conspicuously silent. Clara Vane, Silas's estranged niece who had recently returned to care for her dear uncle, was arranging preserves on the jam stall with mechanical precision. She did not look toward the shed, did not join the gossip circles, did not ask the police for news of her missing uncle. She simply aligned jars of strawberry preserve with obsessive care, her face an unreadable mask. Most would call it shock or the stoicism of good breeding. Miss Marple, remembering a housemaid who had once calmly dusted an entire drawing room after breaking a valuable vase, recognized it as something else entirely, the rigid control of someone waiting for a blow they knew was coming. The gossip was noise. Clara's silence was a signal that spoke volumes to those who knew how to listen. Miss Marple's attention remained fixed on Clara Vane as the afternoon progressed, though her observation was so subtle that even the sharp-eyed village gossips failed to notice her interest. The young woman's rigid control had not relaxed despite the passage of time, and there was something in her mechanical movements that reminded Miss Marple uncomfortably of a music box dancer, beautiful, precise, and utterly artificial. "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, approaching the jam stall with the unhurried gait of someone seeking nothing more than a pleasant conversation, "you look quite pale. Perhaps you should sit down for a moment." Clara started at the voice, her hands jerking so suddenly that she nearly upset a jar of strawberry preserve. "Oh, Miss Marple, I didn't see you there." "I'm perfectly well, thank you. Just concerned about Uncle Silas, naturally." "Naturally," Miss Marple agreed, her pale blue eyes noting the way Clara avoided using her uncle's name in the present tense, as though she already knew he was beyond present concerns. "Though I must say, it's unlike Mr. Vane to miss a church function. He's always been most particular about his duties." Before Clara could respond, Inspector Slack's voice cut across the garden with the authority of a man bearing significant news. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I might have your attention." The conversations died away as effectively as if someone had turned off a wireless. "I've just received word from the constable at Mr. Vane's cottage. The gentleman has been found." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the distant sound of a wood pigeon calling from the churchyard elms. Miss Marple watched the faces around her with the detached interest of someone observing a particularly revealing tableau. Mrs. Price Ridley's expression shifted from anticipation to something resembling disappointment. Her theory about tramps was clearly about to be disproven. The Reverend Clement looked genuinely distressed, while his wife pressed a hand to her mouth in shock. Clara Vane, however, remained perfectly still, her face a mask of careful composure that revealed nothing at all. "Mr. Vane is deceased," Slack continued, his voice carrying the flat professionalism of a man who had delivered such news many times before. "He was discovered in his own parlor, victim of what appears to be a violent attack. The medical examiner estimates the time of death as sometime between Sunday evening and Monday morning." The reaction was immediate and varied. Miss Hartnell gave a theatrical gasp and clutched at Colonel Bantry's arm for support. Young Mr. Finch, who had been hovering near the tombola with the air of someone desperately wishing to be elsewhere, went white as a parchment and swayed visibly. Tom Briggs muttered something under his breath that sounded distinctly like a prayer. "The weapon," Slack added, his gaze sweeping the assembled crowd, "appears to have been a heavy brass object, consistent with the candlestick we discovered in the vicarage shed. We're treating this as a case of murder, and I'll need to speak with anyone who had contact with Mr. Vane after Sunday's evening service." Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their gentle clicking as she processed this information. The timeline was significant. Whoever had killed Silas Vane had acted with considerable planning, stealing the candlestick after evensong when the church would be empty, committing the murder that same night, and then hiding the weapon in the vicarage shed during the narrow window when it stood unattended. This spoke of someone intimately familiar with village routines, someone who moved through St. Mary Mead with such naturalness that their presence would excite no comment. "I didn't do it." The voice cracked across the garden like a whip, and all heads turned toward Mr. Finch, who stood trembling beneath the elm tree. "I know we argued, but I would never—" His voice broke entirely, and he pressed his hands to his face. Inspector Slack's notebook appeared with practiced efficiency. "What was the nature of this argument, Mr. Finch?" He accused me of being incompetent. Said the organ playing was disgraceful, and that he'd speak to the bishop about having me removed." Finch's words tumbled over each other in his haste to explain. "But I was practicing until nearly midnight on Sunday. Mrs. Bantry heard me. She complained about the noise the next morning." Miss Marple filed this information away carefully. A public argument was often a red herring in cases like this. The real motive was usually something quieter, more personal. Her gaze drifted to Clara Vane, who was listening to the exchange with an expression of polite interest that seemed oddly detached for someone who had just learned of her uncle's violent death. "Miss Vane," Slack's voice cut through her thoughts, "I'll need to speak with you as well. When did you last see your uncle alive?" "Sunday afternoon," Clara replied promptly, her voice steady. "We had tea together after the morning service. He seemed quite well, though perhaps a little preoccupied." "Preoccupied how?" Clara hesitated for just a moment, so briefly that Miss Marple doubted anyone else noticed it. "He mentioned having some business to attend to. He didn't elaborate, and I didn't press him for details. Uncle Silas was a private man." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened slightly. There was something in that hesitation, something in the careful way Clara chose her words, that suggested the conversation had been rather more significant than a casual mention of business. But before she could pursue this line of thought further, she noticed something else that struck her as distinctly odd. Mrs. Hartnell, usually the first to insert herself into any village drama, was standing apart from the crowd near the Achium garden wall, her face pale and her hands clutching her handbag with white-knuckled intensity. She was staring not at Inspector Slack or the suspects, but at the shed where the candlestick had been hidden, and her expression was one of unmistakable terror. Most curious indeed. Miss Marple allowed her knitting to settle in her lap as she observed Mrs. Hartnell's increasingly agitated behavior. The woman had retreated further from the crowd, positioning herself behind the ancient yew tree with the desperate air of someone seeking sanctuary from unwanted scrutiny. This was profoundly uncharacteristic of a person who typically inserted herself into the very heart of village dramas, armed with theories and moral pronouncements in equal measure. With the unhurried grace of someone merely seeking a quieter spot for reflection, Miss Marple rose and drifted across the lawn toward the trembling figure. As she approached, Mrs. Hartnell made a valiant attempt to compose her features, though the effort only served to highlight her distress more clearly. "My dear Mrs. Hartnell," Miss Marple said gently, settling herself on a nearby garden bench, "you look quite overwrought. This business is shocking, naturally, but I wonder if perhaps you ought to sit down for a moment." Mrs. Hartnell's fingers tightened convulsively around her handbag handle. "I'm perfectly well, thank you," she replied, though her voice carried a tremor that belied her words. "This whole affair is most disturbing, of course, but I am not one to succumb to vapors at the first sign of unpleasantness." "Indeed not," Miss Marple agreed warmly. "You have always shown remarkable fortitude, though I must say that shade does look rather ominous now, doesn't it? So peculiar that anyone should choose the vicarage garden as a hiding place for such a dreadful thing." At this observation, Mrs. Hartnell's gaze flickered involuntarily toward the weathered wooden structure, and Miss Marple noted the way her breathing quickened. "Yes, most peculiar," Mrs. Hartnell managed. "Though criminals rarely think clearly, do they?" "On the contrary," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "they often think quite logically in their own fashion. They choose places they know intimately, locations where their presence would attract no particular notice. Rather like my nephew Raymond when he was small. He always hid his forbidden sweets in the same tin behind the parlor clock, because it was familiar territory." Mrs. Hartnell's composure cracked visibly. "I really don't see what this has to do with anything, Miss Marple." "Oh, nothing at all, I'm certain," Miss Marple replied with a deprecating smile. "I was merely thinking aloud. Such a dreadful habit at my age. Though it did occur to me that you might have particular insights about those candlesticks, having been so instrumental in their acquisition for the church." Inspector Slack, who had been observing this exchange with growing interest, approached with his characteristic directness. "Mrs. Hartnell, you seem distressed about something beyond the general circumstances. Is there something you'd like to tell me?" The woman's shoulders sagged as though she had been carrying an unbearable weight. "I was here Monday evening," she admitted in barely more than a whisper. "I'd forgotten my reading glasses after helping with the flower arrangements. When I returned around 8 o'clock to collect them, I saw someone coming out of that shed." Slack's notebook appeared with practiced efficiency. "Who did you see?" Mrs. Hartnell's voice dropped even lower. "It was growing dark, but there was still sufficient light to make out a figure in a dark coat. The person moved quickly, purposefully, but there was something about the gait." She paused, struggling with the implications of her words. "I believe it was Clara Vane. She has a very distinctive walk, you see, from that childhood injury. Quick and slightly uneven." The revelation hung in the air like an accusation that could not be withdrawn. Miss Marple's needles resumed their gentle clicking as she processed this information, noting how it aligned with the timeline they had established. Before anyone could respond further, the vicarage door opened and Mr. Finch emerged, looking even more haggard than before. He was followed by a constable, suggesting his interview had raised more questions than it had answered. As he descended the steps, he nearly collided with Clara Vane, who was approaching for her own questioning. "Mind yourself," Clara said sharply, her earlier composure momentarily fracturing to reveal something harder beneath. "I'm terribly sorry," Finch stammered, backing away. "The inspector keeps asking about Sunday night. He won't accept that I was simply practicing the organ." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting with mild interest. "The church organ has that distinctive wheeze on the lower G, does it not, Mr. Finch? I imagine that would be quite audible from the village, particularly during evening practice." "Yes, exactly," Finch said with sudden hope. "I played that passage repeatedly. It was sticking dreadfully." Anyone who heard would know it was actually being played, not some recording as the inspector suggested. And from the organ loft, Miss Marple continued conversationally. One has quite a clear view of the village, particularly Mr. Vane's cottage. Did you happen to notice anything unusual during your practice? Finch frowned in concentration. I was focused on the music, but there was one moment. Around 9 o'clock, I think. I thought I saw something white moving quickly near Uncle Silas's cottage gate. I assumed it was a stray cat, but now that I think about it, it moved more like a person. Someone in a light-colored coat, perhaps, moving very quickly. Almost as if they were running. Clara Vane's face had gone perfectly still during this exchange, her earlier sharpness replaced by careful neutrality. "How fascinating," she said coolly, "though I hardly see how shadows and suppositions help us now. Uncle Silas is dead, and speculation won't change that unfortunate fact." Miss Marple observed the younger woman with quiet interest, noting the tension in her shoulders and the way she avoided meeting anyone's eyes directly. "Of course, my dear," she said gently, "though it is remarkable how often small details prove significant when viewed in proper context." Inspector Slack cleared his throat authoritatively. "Miss Vane, I'll need you to come to the station for a formal statement. Immediately, if you please." Clara smoothed her skirt with deliberate care. "Certainly, Inspector. I'm entirely at your service." As she walked toward the waiting constable, Miss Marple noted that distinctive gait Mrs. Hartnell had described, subtle but unmistakable to those who knew what to observe. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to arrange themselves, though the complete picture remained tantalizingly unclear. "Inspector," Miss Marple said quietly as Slack prepared to follow his suspect, "you might find it useful to inquire about light-colored garments, and perhaps the exact time Mr. Vane typically locked his doors for the evening." Slack paused, his expression suggesting he was beginning to appreciate the value of Miss Marple's seemingly innocent observations. "Right you are, Miss Marple. I'll be sure to ask." As the official party departed for the police station, Miss Marple remained in the garden, her knitting needles moving with their customary rhythm. The afternoon shadows were lengthening, and the cheerful bustle of the garden tea had given way to an atmosphere of subdued tension. Somewhere in the accumulating details, the bloodied candlestick, the Monday evening sighting, the running figure in white, Clara's careful composure, lay the path to understanding not just what had happened to Silas Vane, but why. Human nature, Miss Marple reflected, was remarkably consistent in its patterns, even when people believed themselves to be acting with perfect cunning. The truth had a way of revealing itself through the smallest gestures and the most carefully guarded words, and she suspected that before long the real story would emerge from beneath the layers of deception and misdirection that currently obscured it. The garden tea continued in diminished form after Clara's departure, though the festive atmosphere had transformed entirely. The remaining guests clustered in small groups, their voices carrying that peculiar mixture of horror and fascination that accompanies proximity to violent death. Miss Marple remained in her corner, her knitting providing the perfect excuse for prolonged observation, while conversations swirled around her like leaves in an autumn wind. Mrs. Price Ridley had assumed command of the tea-urn with the determined air of someone maintaining civilization through sheer force of will. "More tea, Colonel Bantry?" "This dreadful business has upset us all, naturally, though I must say the signs were there for those who chose to see them." "What signs?" Mrs. Bantry leaned forward with the expression of someone about to share crucial intelligence. "I saw Clara Vane on Monday morning coming out of the post office looking absolutely thunderous. Nearly knocked into me without so much as an apology, clutching some sort of telegram or letter." "What time was this?" Miss Marple inquired gently, her needles never pausing in their rhythm. "Just after 10 o'clock. I was collecting my parcel from London." Clara's face was quite flushed, most unbecoming, and she was gripping that paper as though it contained the most dreadful news. Miss Marple filed this information with considerable interest. a communication received Monday morning, followed by Clara's appearance at the shed Monday evening with what Mrs. Hartnell believed to be the murder weapon. The sequence suggested a catalyst, some piece of information that had precipitated immediate action. Before she could pursue this line of thought further, young Tom Briggs approached with the hesitant air of someone carrying an unwelcome burden. "Miss Marple," he said quietly, "might I have a word? There's something I should have mentioned earlier, but I was afraid it might sound, well, incriminating." "Of course, Tom," she replied warmly, gathering her knitting. "Perhaps we might walk toward the churchyard, where we can speak privately." Once they were sufficiently distant from the remaining guests, Tom's words emerged in an anxious rush. "I was walking home from the pub Sunday night around 9:30, stayed later than usual for a darts match, and I passed Mr. Vane's cottage. The front door was standing wide open, which struck me as peculiar because he was always so particular about security." Miss Marple nodded encouragingly. "Go on, Tom." I called out, thinking perhaps he'd stepped into the garden, but there was no answer. I was about to investigate when I heard footsteps from inside the cottage. Quick, light steps like someone moving with great urgency. I'm ashamed to say I hurried on rather than waiting to see who emerged. I'd had a pint or two, you understand, and didn't want Mr. Vane to catch me in that condition. "These footsteps," Miss Marple said carefully. "Were they heavy or light?" Tom frowned in concentration. "Definitely light, quick and light with a sort of rustling sound, as though the person wore something that swished when they moved. A long coat, perhaps, or a full skirt." "Did you see anyone leave the cottage?" "No, I was already down the lane by then. I felt rather cowardly afterward, but at the time I simply wanted to reach home." His face was earnest with appeal. "Should I tell Inspector Slack? I'm worried he'll think I was involved, being there at that very time." "You must certainly tell the inspector everything," Miss Marple assured him. "Truth has a way of protecting innocent people, while concealment breeds only suspicion." As Tom hurried toward the vicarage to make his confession, Miss Marple remained in the churchyard, her mind working with mechanical precision. The timeline was crystallizing. Sunday evening around 9:30, someone had been in Silas Vane's cottage, someone who moved quickly and wore rustling fabric. Monday evening at 8 o'clock, Mrs. Hartnell had observed a figure she believed to be Clara, leaving the vicarage shed. But the gap between these events troubled her considerably. If Silas Vane had been killed Sunday evening, why had the murderer waited until Monday evening to dispose of the weapon? The delay suggested either extreme caution or some complicating factor that had prevented immediate action. Her gaze fell upon something that made her pause. Near the base of the ancient yew tree, partially obscured by fallen needles, lay a small object that caught the fading light. Bending with careful dignity, she retrieved what proved to be a button. Not an ordinary village button, but mother of pearl with the distinctive marking of a London dressmaker whose work she recognized from more prosperous days. The button was freshly torn, thread still attached, suggesting recent loss under circumstances involving considerable force. More significantly, it was the sort found on expensive garments, the kind worn by someone with sophisticated taste and substantial means. Miss Marple turned the button thoughtfully in her fingers. Clara Vane had spent years in London as a companion to a wealthy widow, and would certainly possess such clothing. But then, several residents of St. Mary Mead maintained connections to the capital and might own similar garments. The telephone's shrill ring from the vicarage interrupted her contemplation. Through the open windows, she could hear the Reverend Clement's startled exclamations, followed by Inspector Slack's authoritative tones. When the vicar emerged moments later, his face had gone quite pale. "That was Slack with the post-mortem results," he announced to the remaining guests. "Silas died from a single blow to the back of the head, delivered with considerable force. The doctor found traces of candle wax embedded in the wound, confirming our suspicions about the weapon. Death occurred between 9 and 11 Sunday evening." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. The medical evidence aligned perfectly with Tom's testimony about the footsteps and open door. Someone had been in that cottage during the crucial window, someone who had struck down Silas Vane and then vanished into the night. But who? And more importantly, why had they waited nearly 24 hours before hiding the evidence in the vicarage shed? The answer to that question, Miss Marple suspected, lay in understanding what had arrived in Monday morning's post to so dramatically affect Clara Vane's composure. The puzzle was assembling itself piece by careful piece, but the complete picture remained tantalizingly beyond reach. What she needed now was not more speculation, but a clearer understanding of the relationships and secrets that bound these people together, the hidden currents beneath the placid surface of village life that could drive someone to commit murder in broad daylight, metaphorically speaking. Human nature, she reflected, was remarkably predictable in its unpredictability, and somewhere in the accumulating details lay the key to understanding not just what had happened to Silas Vane, but why someone had felt compelled to end his life with such brutal finality. The following morning brought with it the peculiar mixture of normalcy and unease that settles over a community touched by violent death. Miss Marple had risen early, her mind occupied with the various threads of evidence that seemed to pull in different directions, each promising revelation while withholding final clarity. The mother-of-pearl button lay on her breakfast table beside the Morning Post, a small but potentially significant piece of a puzzle that grew more complex with each passing hour. Her contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of Billy Fletcher, the village postman, whose eagerness to share information had made him an invaluable source of intelligence over the years. This morning, he fairly vibrated with the importance of his news as Miss Marple invited him in for tea and a slice of seed cake. "The whole village is in an uproar, Miss Marple," he announced, accepting the refreshment gratefully. "Inspector Slack's had Miss Vane at the station since dawn, and the questions he's been asking, well, they're not the sort you'd put to someone you consider innocent." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured encouragingly, her knitting needles resuming their gentle rhythm. "And what of that telegram you delivered Monday morning? I understand it quite upset Miss Vane." Billy's expression grew grave. "Pemberton and Sons, the London solicitors. Very respectable firm they are. I delivered it myself around 9:30, and Miss Vane went white as a sheet when she read it. Thanked me rather absently and shut the door quite quickly, which wasn't her usual manner at all." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Legal correspondence that prompted such a reaction, followed by evening activity at the vicarage shed, suggested matters of considerable urgency. After Billy departed with his remaining deliveries, she made her way to the village shop, where the unofficial intelligence network of St. Mary Mead was operating at full capacity. Mrs. Bantry was already deep in animated conversation with the proprietress when Miss Marple entered, and both women turned to her with the expressions of people bursting with significant news. "The most extraordinary development," Mrs. Bantry announced without preamble. "I've just learned from Mrs. Price Ridley, who had it from her cousin in London, that Silas Vane changed his will only 3 weeks ago. The original document left everything to Clara, naturally, but apparently there was some sort of falling out between them." "A falling out?" Miss Marple inquired, selecting a packet of needles with careful attention to their quality. "Clara made some unfortunate remarks at the church social about her uncle's business practices being morally questionable," the shopkeeper explained. "You know how Silas prided himself on his reputation. He was furious, absolutely furious, said she was an ungrateful girl who didn't deserve his consideration." The timeline was becoming clearer. A quarrel, a changed will, and then Monday's telegram from the solicitors, quite possibly informing Clara of her disinheritance. The motive was crystallizing into something comprehensible, though Miss Marple remained troubled by certain inconsistencies that didn't align with a simple crime of passion. Her reflections were interrupted by the arrival of Mr. Finch, whose appearance had deteriorated markedly since the previous day. His hands trembled as he made his purchases, and he started violently when the shop bell announced another customer's entrance. "Mr. Finch," Miss Marple said gently. "You look quite unwell. This dreadful business has affected us all, but you seem particularly distressed." The young organist's composure crumbled entirely under her kind scrutiny. "Inspector Slack keeps implying that I'm fabricating my alibi about Sunday evening. He says anyone could have made those organ sounds, that there's no real proof I was there when I claimed." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "But I was there, Miss Marple, and I heard—" He broke off, glancing nervously around the shop. "What did you hear, my dear?" Miss Marple's voice carried the gentle authority of someone accustomed to coaxing truth from reluctant witnesses. "When I left the church around 10 o'clock, I passed Mr. Vane's cottage," Finch admitted reluctantly. "The lights were still burning, which seemed odd for such a late hour. And I heard voices. Raised voices. One was definitely Silas, sharp and angry as always. The other was higher pitched, possibly a woman's voice, though I couldn't make out the actual words through the closed windows." "Did you recognize the second voice?" Finch's face was anguished with uncertainty. "I thought at the time it might be Clara, but I couldn't be certain. The voices were muffled, and I didn't want to appear to be eavesdropping. I hurried on home." He looked at Miss Marple with desperate appeal. "Should I tell the inspector? It seems to point directly at Clara, and I have no wish to condemn someone who might be innocent." Before Miss Marple could respond, the sound of an approaching motor car drew their attention to the window. It was not the familiar police vehicle, but an elegant, dark saloon that looked entirely out of place on the village's narrow lanes. The car stopped near the shop, and a man emerged, tall, well-dressed in expensive city clothes, with the bearing of someone accustomed to command but currently out of his element. "Excuse me," he called, approaching the shop with purposeful strides. "I'm looking for Miss Clara Vane. I was told she might be in the village." Miss Marple observed him with sharp interest as Mrs. Bantry explained that Clara was currently assisting the police with their inquiries. There was something about his manner, a combination of urgency and barely controlled anxiety, that suggested more than casual concern for an acquaintance. "My name is Julian Fortescue," the stranger said, removing his hat to reveal graying temples and intelligent eyes. "I'm a friend of Miss Vane's from London. I received a rather distressing letter from her this morning and came down immediately." "A distressing letter?" Miss Marple inquired politely, noting the quality of his clothing and the slight tremor in his hands as he replaced his hat. Fortescue hesitated, clearly weighing how much to reveal. She wrote that she was in serious trouble, that her uncle had discovered something about her past and was threatening to expose her. She asked for my advice, both as a friend and in my professional capacity as a barrister. The revelation hung in the air like an accusation. Here was motive delivered with startling clarity. Blackmail, that most corrosive of crimes, which had driven many to desperate measures. As Miss Marple studied Mr. Fortescue's face, her gaze fell upon his coat, a fine camel-hair garment of obvious quality. Near the left cuff, she noticed, several threads hung loose where a button had been recently torn away. The pattern of loss was distinctive, suggesting considerable force had been applied. With careful casualness, Miss Marple withdrew the mother-of-pearl button from her knitting bag, ostensibly to examine a dropped stitch. The match was unmistakable. The same distinctive pattern, the same quality of workmanship as the remaining buttons on Mr. Fortescue's coat. "Mr. Fortescue," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet of the shop. "You mentioned coming down from London just this morning. I don't suppose you visited St. Mary Mead before?" "Never," he replied, perhaps a shade too quickly. "I had to ask directions at the railway station." Miss Marple met his gaze with an expression of mild confusion. "How very curious. I could have sworn I noticed a motor car very much like yours near the woods on Sunday evening, just as I was returning from visiting Mrs. Pigeoncote. But perhaps my eyes deceived me in the twilight. They do play such tricks at my age." The effect was immediate and telling. Fortescue's face went rigid, the colour draining from his cheeks as his hand moved unconsciously to his coat cuff. "You must be mistaken, madam. I was in London all weekend." "Of course," Miss Marple murmured, returning her attention to her knitting with apparent dismissal. "Though it is remarkable how distinctive certain details can be. Tire tracks in soft earth, for instance, or the particular sound of a motor engine. But I'm sure you're quite right." She had seen no such car, naturally, nor visited Mrs. Pigeoncote recently, but the reaction, the sudden tension in his jaw, the defensive positioning of his shoulders, confirmed what the button had already suggested. Julian Fortescue had been in St. Mary Mead before today, almost certainly on Sunday evening when Silas Vane met his violent end. The circle of suspects was expanding even as the police focused their attention on Clara. A disinherited niece, a mysterious London barrister with secrets of his own, a missing button found near the scene, and the persistent question of why the murder weapon had been concealed a full day after the crime. The pieces were beginning to form a picture, but it was far more complex than Inspector Slack's current theory suggested. Miss Marple knew, with the certainty born of long experience in human nature, that the truth lay in understanding not just what had happened on Sunday evening, but what had transpired during the crucial 24 hours that followed. Someone had been very clever indeed, but cleverness, she had observed, often contained the seeds of its own undoing. Julian Fortescue's motor car had barely disappeared around the corner when Inspector Slack emerged from the police station, his expression thunderous with the particular frustration of a man whose carefully constructed case had just encountered an unexpected obstacle. Miss Marple, who had been observing this development from her position near the village green, approached with the unhurried gait of someone bearing information that might prove illuminating. "Inspector," she said gently, "I believe Mr. Fortescue may be returning shortly. There are certain matters regarding his presence in the village that require clarification." Before Slack could respond, the sound of an approaching motor announced Fortescue's return. The barrister emerged from his vehicle with the determined air of someone who had reached an unpalatable but necessary decision. His earlier composure had given way to something raw, the expression of a man confronting the consequences of choices made in haste and desperation. "Inspector Slack," he announced without preamble, "I must speak with you immediately regarding Miss Vane's case. I have been less than forthcoming about certain aspects of my involvement in this matter." Slack's eyes narrowed with professional interest. "Indeed, Mr. Fortescue. Miss Marple here has been suggesting you might have been in St. Mary Mead rather earlier than you claimed." Miss Marple withdrew the mother-of-pearl button from her knitting bag, holding it delicately between her fingers. "This was found near the churchyard yew tree, Mr. Fortescue. I believe it matches those on your coat rather precisely." Fortescue's gaze fell upon the button, and his shoulders sagged with visible defeat. "Yes," he said quietly, his professional demeanor cracking entirely. "It is mine. I lost it Sunday evening when I—" He stopped, gathering himself with visible effort. "Inspector, I must tell you what actually occurred that night." The confession, when it came, emerged in measured tones that spoke of a man accustomed to presenting facts, however damaging they might prove. Fortescue had indeed arrived in St. Mary Mead on Sunday evening, responding to Clara's desperate letter about her uncle's threats. He had found Silas Vane's cottage door standing ajar, the interior in disarray, and the churchwarden already dead from a savage blow to the head. The brass candlestick was lying beside the body. Fortescue continued, his voice steady despite the gravity of his admission. "I panicked, Inspector. I knew how it would appear. Clara's friend from London, present at the scene of her uncle's murder. I took the weapon, thinking to dispose of it and protect her from suspicion." "But you didn't dispose of it immediately," Slack observed with sharp attention. "Our witness saw someone hiding it in the vicarage shed Monday evening." Fortescue's face reflected genuine anguish. "I kept it in my motor car overnight, hidden in the woods beyond the village. Every plan I considered seemed to implicate either Clara or myself further." Monday evening, I returned intending to throw it in the river, but I saw police activity near the water. In desperation, I concealed it in the first location I encountered, the vicarage shed. Miss Marple's needles had resumed their gentle rhythm as she absorbed this information. "Mr. Fortescue," she said thoughtfully, "when you discovered Mr. Vane's body, was there anything else unusual about the scene? Any detail that struck you as significant?" The barrister frowned in concentration. The room showed signs of a violent struggle, but what disturbed me most was finding a woman's glove near the fireplace. Expensive kid leather, quite distinctive. I assumed it belonged to Clara, which only increased my determination to remove any evidence that might connect her to the crime. "You assumed it was Clara's," Miss Marple repeated carefully. "But you didn't verify this assumption?" "No," Fortescue admitted, understanding dawning in his expression. "I simply took the candlestick and fled. The glove remained where it lay." Inspector Slack had been scribbling furiously in his notebook throughout this exchange. "This changes everything," he muttered. "If you move the weapon, Miss Vane's presence at the shed Monday evening takes on an entirely different significance." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed, "though I suspect there are deeper currents at work here than simple inheritance disputes. Mr. Vane was not, by all accounts, a man who made enemies through mere personality conflicts." Before anyone could pursue this observation further, a constable approached at a run, his face flushed with exertion and excitement. "Inspector," he called breathlessly, "there's been a break-in at the Vane cottage. Someone's turned the place upside down during the night. Every drawer emptied, every cupboard searched. Looks like they were hunting for something specific." Miss Marple exchanged a meaningful glance with Fortescue, whose face had gone pale. "A thorough search," she murmured. "The sort conducted by someone seeking particular documents, perhaps. Papers that might prove embarrassing if discovered by the authorities." The implication hung in the air like an unspoken accusation. Someone had realized, somewhat belatedly, that Silas Vane's death might not be sufficient to protect their secrets, not if he had kept written records of his more questionable activities. The break-in suggested desperation, the actions of someone who understood that their safety depended upon destroying evidence that could connect them to motives far more compelling than simple greed or family quarrels. Miss Marple gathered her knitting with quiet satisfaction. The puzzle was revealing its true shape at last, though she suspected the complete picture would prove more complex and disturbing than anyone yet imagined. The scene at Silas Vane's cottage confirmed the constable's breathless report with disturbing thoroughness. Every room bore evidence of systematic, almost frantic searching. Drawers pulled from their housings, books swept from shelves, cushions slashed open to reveal their stuffing. Yet amid this chaos, Miss Marple noted with particular interest certain items remained untouched. The silver tea service stood undisturbed on the sideboard, and a small collection of valuable coins remained in plain view on the desk. This was not the work of common thieves seeking portable wealth, but someone hunting for specific documents with single-minded determination. Inspector Slack surveyed the devastation with grim satisfaction, though his expression shifted when a constable emerged from the study carrying a small leather-bound notebook sealed in an evidence bag. "Found this under the coal scuttle, sir. Looks like it was dropped in the haste." Slack took the notebook, flipping it open with a gloved hand. His eyes widened as he scanned the pages. "Names," he muttered. "Dates. Sums of money. And good Lord, this goes back years." Miss Marple did not attempt to peer at the pages. She had no need. The expression on Slack's face, the tightening of his mouth at certain entries, told her almost more than the words themselves could have done. "Anyone we know, Inspector?" she asked gently. He shut the book with a snap. "More than I'd like. Pillars of the community, you might say. This confirms it. Vane was running a regular blackmail enterprise." Clara Vane, who had been released from custody following Fortescue's confession, stood in the doorway with an expression that mingled grief with something approaching relief. Uncle Silas was obsessed with propriety and reputation, she said quietly. He believed everyone harbored secrets that needed exposing. It was his particular vice, collecting information about people, using it to maintain his position of moral authority. Before anyone could respond further, Mrs. Hartnell appeared at the cottage gate, her face flushed with the exertion of hurrying and the burden of fresh intelligence. "Inspector, I've just remembered something absolutely crucial about that young Dr. Roberts, Haydock's locum. Last week I saw him arguing with Silas near the old mill. I heard Silas mention professional misconduct and the medical board." Dr. Roberts looked absolutely murderous. Miss Marple's needles clicked thoughtfully as she processed this information. Another victim of Silas's systematic extortion, another person with compelling reason to desire the churchwarden's silence. "And the organist, Mr. Finch," she observed quietly. "Silas knew about your brother's difficulties, did he not?" Finch, who had been hovering miserably near the doorway, started as though struck. "He demanded money I didn't have," he confessed hoarsely. "Threatened to write to the bishop about my brother's embezzlement. Said no church would employ a criminal's relative." The revelation that followed struck with even greater force. Mrs. Hartnell, her composure finally cracking under the weight of accumulated fear, admitted through tears that she too had been paying Silas for years. Money to suppress embarrassing letters from her youth that could have destroyed her marriage and social standing. "The pattern becomes clear," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, her gaze moving between the assembled faces. "Mr. Vane had created quite an enterprise for himself, hadn't he? But what troubles me most is not the extent of his activities, but the manner of their discovery. This notebook, for instance. Why was it left behind when everything else was so thoroughly searched?" Inspector Slack frowned. "You think it was planted?" "I think," Miss Marple replied carefully, "that we are observing the actions of someone who understands human nature remarkably well. Someone who knew precisely how to direct suspicion toward others while concealing their own involvement. The glove Mr. Fortescue mentioned, the button from his coat found near the churchyard. These are not accidents, but calculated misdirection." Griselda Clement appeared at the garden gate, her face troubled. "Miss Marple, I've just realized something dreadful. The heavy ledger where Silas recorded the vestry accounts. It's missing from the church. He took it home last week to reconcile the figures, but if someone ransacked his cottage looking for records, they would almost certainly have taken the ledger," Miss Marple finished softly. "Not necessarily for the accounts themselves, but for what might be concealed within its pages. Silas was methodical. He would keep his most sensitive records in a place that appeared perfectly innocent to casual observation. The implications settled over them like a cold mist. Somewhere, the real evidence of Silas Vane's blackmail operation remained hidden, evidence that could expose not just his victims, but the person desperate enough to kill him for it." Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the church tower, rising solid and silent against the evening sky. If Silas had sensed danger, she reflected, where would such a careful, systematic man hide his most precious secrets? Perhaps not in his cottage at all, but in the one place he considered truly secure, the sanctuary he was sworn to protect, and which he had so cynically betrayed. The answer, she suspected, lay waiting in the very heart of St. Mary Mead's spiritual center, hidden in plain sight, where only the guilty would think to look. The church investigation began at Miss Marple's gentle but insistent suggestion, though she approached the ancient building with the measured pace of someone whose conclusions were already forming with crystalline clarity. The evening shadows had deepened considerably, lending an air of solemnity to their procession across the churchyard, where generations of St. Mary Mead residents lay in their final rest, untroubled by the corruption that had festered among the living. Inspector Slack's torch beam cut through the gathering gloom as they entered the nave, illuminating dust motes that danced in the still air like guilty secrets finally exposed to light. The Reverend Clement moved with obvious reluctance, his keys jangling softly as he unlocked the vestry door, though Miss Marple noted that his hesitation seemed born more of spiritual distress than any fear of what they might discover. If Silas kept backup records, she observed quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the church's perfect acoustics, he would have chosen somewhere that appeared entirely natural to his routine. Somewhere he could access regularly without exciting comment or suspicion. Her gaze drifted upward toward the organ loft, where Mr. Finch claimed to have been practicing during the crucial hours of Sunday evening. The elevated position commanded a clear view not only of the nave and chancel, but through the western windows toward the lane where Silas Vane's cottage stood in its neat garden. If the young organist had indeed been there, as he claimed, his observations would prove far more significant than his nervous testimony had yet revealed. "Mr. Finch," Miss Marple called gently, "would you be so kind as to demonstrate that troublesome lower G you mentioned, the one that requires such careful coaxing during your practice sessions?" The organist mounted the narrow stairs with visible reluctance, his footsteps echoing in the vaulted space. Moments later, the familiar wheeze of the aging instrument filled the church as he attempted the problematic note. But instead of the expected asthmatic protest, there came a distinct mechanical obstruction, a muffled resistance that suggested something had been deliberately placed within the organ's workings. Inspector Slack's professional instincts sharpened immediately. "What's behind that panel there?" he demanded, indicating the wooden facing beneath the keyboard that sat slightly proud of its neighbors, as though recently disturbed. The discovery that followed exceeded even Miss Marple's expectations. Wrapped in oiled cloth and wedged carefully against the bellows mechanism lay not merely correspondence or financial records, but a complete duplicate of Silas Vane's blackmail enterprise. Names, dates, photographs, and detailed accounts of every victim's particular vulnerability. The scope was breathtaking in its systematic cruelty, encompassing not just the obvious suspects, but extending throughout the county to include magistrates, clergy, and prominent business figures. "Good Lord," Slack muttered, his face grim as he scanned the meticulous entries. "Half the establishments represented here. No wonder someone was desperate enough to commit murder." Mrs. Hartnell, who had accompanied them despite her earlier distress, made a strangled sound of recognition as certain names became visible. "He knew everything," she whispered, her composure finally cracking entirely. "Every indiscretion, every moment of weakness. He made us feel like criminals for simply being human." The confession that followed emerged in broken phrases punctuated by tears of rage rather than grief. Mrs. Hartnell had indeed visited the church Sunday evening, driven by desperation after Silas had demanded an additional payment she could not afford. Finding the building empty, she had waited in the vestry, eventually hearing voices from the direction of his cottage, an argument that had grown increasingly heated before ending in sudden, ominous silence. "I should have investigated," she admitted through her tears, "but I was terrified of confronting him with another person present. I fled through the woods like a coward, and if I had stayed, perhaps you would have become another victim," Miss Marple interrupted gently. "For the person who killed Silas Vane was not acting from sudden passion, but from calculated desperation. Someone who understood that exposure would mean not merely social embarrassment, but complete ruin." As they descended from the organ loft, Miss Marple's mind worked with mechanical precision, assembling the accumulated evidence into its proper pattern. The hidden records revealed the true scope of Silas's activities, but more importantly, they confirmed her growing suspicion about the murderer's identity. One name appeared repeatedly in the documents with annotations that suggested not mere financial extortion, but something far more damaging. Evidence of professional misconduct that would have meant imprisonment rather than social disgrace. The break-in at the cottage, the careful timing of the weapon's concealment, the systematic search for these very records, all pointed to someone who moved through the village with complete naturalness, whose presence anywhere would excite no comment whatsoever. Someone who had access to the church, knowledge of village routines, and, most crucially, the kind of secret that made murder seem preferable to exposure. "Inspector," Miss Marple said quietly as they prepared to leave the church, "I believe the time has come for a small experiment. Someone in St. Mary Mead has been remarkably clever, but cleverness often contains the seeds of its own undoing. If we arrange matters properly, the guilty party will reveal themselves through the very precautions they have taken to avoid detection." The plan she outlined was elegantly simple, designed to exploit the one weakness that all successful criminals eventually develop: the compulsion to ensure their safety by monitoring the investigation's progress. Human nature, Miss Marple reflected as they made their preparations, was remarkably consistent in its patterns of self-betrayal. The endgame was approaching with the inexorable logic of a well-constructed puzzle, and with it, the moment when St. Mary Mead's carefully maintained facade of respectability would finally crumble to reveal the corruption that had festered beneath its placid surface. Miss Marple's carefully orchestrated revelation began the following morning with a deceptively simple announcement. Inspector Slack, following her precise instructions despite his obvious skepticism, had arranged for word to spread through the village that a crucial witness had come forward. Someone who had observed the murderer's departure from Silas Vane's cottage on Sunday evening. The witness, young Tom Briggs, positioned conspicuously in the vicarage study window, served as bait for a trap designed to exploit the one weakness all successful criminals eventually develop: the compulsion to monitor threats to their carefully constructed safety. The drawing room had been arranged with deliberate casualness, tea things set out as though this were merely another village social gathering. Miss Marple occupied her customary corner, knitting needles moving with their familiar rhythm as she observed the assembled faces. Clara Vane maintained her composed exterior. Julian Fortescue stood with barrister-like neutrality, while Mrs. Hartnell and Mr. Finch appeared variously distressed and relieved. Dr. Roberts, summoned at Miss Marple's specific request, leaned against the mantelpiece with studied casualness that fooled no one who knew what to observe. "We've made a rather significant discovery," Inspector Slack announced, consulting his notebook with deliberate slowness. "The post-mortem findings have been reviewed by an independent medical examiner, and there are discrepancies in the original assessment." Dr. Roberts's face went very still, though his voice remained professionally steady. "Discrepancies? I hardly see how that's possible, Inspector. The medical evidence was quite conclusive." "Indeed it was," Miss Marple agreed gently, setting down her knitting with quiet finality. "Perhaps too conclusive. You see, Dr. Roberts, when I considered the timeline more carefully, certain inconsistencies became apparent. You estimated Mr. Vane's death as occurring between 9 and 11 Sunday evening, yet the actual pattern of rigor mortis and body temperature, when discovered Monday afternoon, suggests death occurred considerably earlier, closer to 8 o'clock. The silence that followed was profound. Miss Marple continued with the relentless gentleness that made her revelations so devastating. Someone with medical training would understand precisely how to manipulate such findings, particularly when they possessed the convenient alibi of dining with the Bantrys from 7 until 9:30. If death occurred after 9 o'clock, the doctor's presence elsewhere was unshakable. But if it occurred earlier, during that narrow window when the village was largely deserted— "You're suggesting I falsified medical evidence?" Roberts managed, though his voice lacked conviction. "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple replied calmly, "that you used your professional expertise both to commit the crime and to conceal it. The single, precisely delivered blow that killed Silas required medical knowledge of human anatomy. The subsequent manipulation of the post-mortem findings required someone who understood exactly how such evidence would be interpreted." She reached into her knitting bag and withdrew a telegram, placing it on the table with gentle precision. "This arrived this morning, a response to certain inquiries I made with the London Medical Registry. It seems your previous position ended under rather unfortunate circumstances. questions about patient records, falsified certificates, and a young woman's death that was not quite the accident it appeared to be. Dr. Roberts' carefully constructed facade crumbled entirely. "He was going to destroy everything," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Years of study, my entire future, all because of one mistake made when I was desperate and foolish. I went to reason with him Sunday evening to beg for more time. But he laughed at me, said he'd already drafted the letter to the medical board." The confession that followed emerged in broken phrases, each admission stripping away another layer of the careful deception he had constructed. He had struck Silas in a moment of rage, then used his medical knowledge to make the death appear to have occurred later, providing himself with an unshakable alibi. The systematic search for incriminating records, the careful manipulation of evidence, all had been desperate attempts to conceal the truth. As Inspector Slack moved to make the arrest, Miss Marple gathered her knitting with the satisfied air of someone who had completed a particularly complex pattern. "Human nature," she observed quietly as the handcuffs clicked into place, "is remarkably consistent in its capacity for self-deception. We convince ourselves that our actions are justified by circumstances, that we are victims rather than perpetrators. But murder is murder, Dr. Roberts, regardless of the victim's character or the killer's rationalization." The truth had emerged not through dramatic revelation, but through patient observation of human behavior, the small inconsistencies, the careful lies, and ultimately the fatal error of believing oneself too clever to be caught. Justice had been served, though it brought with it the melancholy realization of just how fragile human morality could be when pressed by fear and desperation. The afternoon following Dr. Roberts's arrest found St. Mary Mead settling into that peculiar quiet that follows the resolution of great upheaval. Miss Marple sat in the vicarage drawing-room, her knitting needles moving with their customary rhythm as she observed the various participants in the drama, attempting to process what had been revealed. The Reverend Clement paced before the empty fireplace, his face reflecting the particular distress of a man whose faith in human nature had been severely tested. Inspector Slack entered with uncharacteristic humility, his notebook tucked away and his usual bluster replaced by genuine curiosity. "Miss Marple," he began, settling into the offered chair, "I confess I still don't entirely understand how you identified Roberts so certainly. The evidence seemed to point in so many directions." Miss Marple smiled gently, her pale blue eyes twinkling with quiet satisfaction. "It was never about the physical evidence alone, Inspector, though that certainly confirmed my suspicions. It was about understanding human nature and recognizing patterns of behavior. You see, each suspect revealed their character through their reactions to stress." She paused to count stitches before continuing. "Mr. Finch is fundamentally honest. Had he committed such a crime, his guilt would have consumed him within hours. His nervous breakdown was genuine fear, not concealed culpability. Miss Vane possesses strong moral principles despite her difficult circumstances. She might act desperately to protect others, but murder for inheritance was simply not in her nature. And Mr. Fortescue's actions, however misguided, demonstrated the instincts of someone trying to protect another, not himself." Clara Vane, who had been standing quietly by the window, turned with an expression that mingled relief with profound sadness. "I still cannot quite believe it's over," she said softly. "Uncle Silas seemed so invulnerable, so certain of his control over everyone. To think that his very certainty led to his destruction." Dr. Roberts displayed a particular kind of arrogance, Miss Marple continued thoughtfully. The arrogance of someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions, who believed his judgment was infallible. When I observed him dismissing Mrs. Hartnell's concerns about her prescription last week, the absolute certainty with which he overruled her instincts about her own body, I recognize the dangerous trait. Such men cannot tolerate challenges to their authority, and when faced with exposure, they often believe they can manipulate circumstances as easily as they manipulate medical evidence. Slack leaned forward with interest. "And the timeline manipulation. Precisely. Roberts understood that if death occurred after 9 o'clock Sunday evening, his dinner with the Bantrys provided an unshakable alibi. So he used his medical expertise to make the evidence conform to his needs, adjusting body temperature readings and rigor mortis assessments. It was quite clever, really, but it required him to maintain the deception consistently. And deception, Inspector, has a way of revealing itself through accumulated small inconsistencies. Before anyone could respond further, Slack produced a leather-bound ledger from his briefcase. "Speaking of evidence, Miss Marple, you mentioned we might find additional records. We discovered this behind the portrait in Vane's parlor, exactly where you suggested. It contains the complete details of his blackmail operation, names, amounts, even photographs in some cases." Miss Marple nodded with quiet satisfaction. Silas Vane was far too methodical to destroy such valuable insurance without keeping copies. Men like him never truly trust anyone, including their own memory. The hidden records were his protection against his victims, but they became his final testimony against his killer. Julian Fortescue, who had remained for the resolution despite his earlier departure for London, stepped forward with visible relief. "Miss Marple, I owe you an enormous debt. My interference nearly condemned Clara, while protecting no one. I should have trusted the truth from the beginning. You acted from genuine affection and professional instinct, Mr. Fortescue." She replied warmly. "Human nature compels us to protect those we care about, sometimes unwisely. The important thing is that you found the courage to tell the truth when it mattered most." As the various participants departed to resume their lives, Miss Marple gathered her knitting and prepared to return to her cottage. The case had been resolved satisfactorily, though she recognized that the deeper wounds would require time to heal. St. Mary Mead would recover its placid surface, but the knowledge of what had festered beneath would serve as a valuable reminder about the dangers of unchecked power and moral corruption. Walking through the familiar lanes in the gathering dusk, Miss Marple reflected on the curious nature of justice. Dr. Roberts would face trial for murder, while Silas Vane's systematic cruelty had been ended by the very violence it provoked. The victims who had paid for years would recover their dignity, though the scars would remain. And the village itself would continue its eternal cycle, gradually absorbing this latest tragedy into the tapestry of its long history. Human nature, she concluded as she settled into her favorite chair, was endlessly fascinating in its capacity for both corruption and redemption. The murder weapon discovered in the vicar's garden shed had revealed far more than a single crime. It had exposed the intricate web of fear and desperation that could flourish even in the most respectable communities. But it had also demonstrated that truth, however carefully concealed, inevitably found its way to light through patient observation and understanding of the patterns that governed human behavior. The case was closed, justice had been served, and St. Mary Mead could return to its peaceful routine, wiser perhaps for having confronted the darkness that could lurk beneath even the most tranquil surfaces.